Welcome back, everyone, to the Gentleman's Wrestling Podcast. I am Jesse Collings. Today, we're talking about Paul Heyman, and this is a podcast that I've wanted to do for a little bit of time now. It's something I first started thinking about around 6 months ago, and really wanted to get into the legacy of Paul Heyman, kind of looking at his career, not just over the 5 or 6 year span that people tend to look at his career as the top guy and the head of creative, and basically everyone associates him with ECW, but just overall his entire career and his legacy and kind of what we're going to think about him, when he's no longer in the wrestling sphere. And joining me today is someone I literally cannot pick a better guest to do this show than Joe Lanza. Joe is of the Flagship Wrestling Podcast, the Flagship Wrestling Patreon page. Joe, how are you doing today?
I'm tremendous. I got to be honest, you couldn't pick a better person to do any podcast than Joe Lanza. I mean, let's be honest here, not just because the subject matter happens to be Paul Heyman. I mean, come on.
Yes, but the reason I wanted you to have you on this specific show, Joe, is because not only are you a lifelong, wrestling fan and someone who attended a lot of ECW shows and was really, in the weeds as a fan of ECW, and obviously has followed Paul Heyman's career very closely as a fan. But unlike a lot of people who tend to do like retro reviews, and you have your Jovember to Remember series on the Flagship Wrestling Podcast and on the Patreon page, where you kind of break down the history of ECW in extremely, minute detail. And a lot of people that tend to do retro review podcasts, they kind of just coast off that idea that they were a fan during the time, and so they remember everything that happened. But you really get into the details of what happened. You don't just remember, oh yeah, and then in 1993 this happened. You kind of really do extra research to kind of round out your knowledge. And I think that's something that not a lot of people do. And there's about 1 billion people doing retro review podcasts and history-based podcasts. And so that's why I think you're the perfect person for this, is because not only were you a fan, not only do you have that kind of knowledge that only hardcore fans know, but you've also done a lot of research to kind of round out your knowledge on these kind of subjects. And that's really vital and important.
Yeah, I mean, thanks for the plug for Jovember to Remember. That's behind our Patreon paywall on the $5 tier. But yeah, I mean, I'm learning a lot as I do it too, even though I lived through it and I went to all of these shows. I am putting in a ton of research, and people complain about how slow the series has come together. I'm not pumping out one episode a week, and that's because I am putting in a ton of research and looking at a lot of footage and listening to a ton of audio, sort of to dig into the stories behind ECW that haven't been told. I mean, we've all heard the mass transit story 1,000 times. We've all heard the story about Barely Legal 1,000 times. I'm trying to tell the untold tales and dig a little deeper. So yeah, it has also been a learning experience for me. So, it's my favorite thing that I do, with apologies to Rich Craich. I obviously love the Flagship, but it's really a passion project. And I truly love doing it. And it's something that I do take my time with. And as you said, I do use it as a learning experience for myself too. I've learned a ton just since I've started doing the show.
Yeah. And how many episodes of Jovember are you up to now?
I think we're 21 episodes in. We're going chronologically from 1992, and the plan is to go all the way through WWECW to the true bitter end. And now we are up to mid 1993, and we're about to do the Ultra Class show where Eddie Gilbert resigns as Booker, and our topic of the day, Paul Heyman, takes over. So business is about to pick up, as they say.
Absolutely. And so one of the things that made me think about doing this show is how interesting I find Paul Heyman's career arc to be, specifically the last 2 decades of it, and kind of what does that say about the wrestling atmosphere of the last 20 years. And so to get to Heyman, one of the things that I think is really remarkable is how young he is when he's kind of at his peak of what people think of like peak Paul Heyman. He's 30 years old in 1995. He's 35 when he first kind of appears on WWF television, and that's kind of the end of ECW. He's 41 when he gets fired from WWE in 2006, after the kind of, he didn't see eye to eye on the relaunch with Vince McMahon. And he's so young at that point. And yet over the last 15 to 20 years, his impact on the wrestling business has almost all been from stuff he did in the 1990s. Even though he's been around the business, it's very interesting to me. He's almost like a band that had like these 5 or 6 revolutionary albums that all came out before the band members were like 35. And since then, they've kind of been, I don't want to say coasting off of their hits, but they're not establishing a new legacy for themselves. I don't know do you object to that, or how do you view his last like 15 or 20 years of his career, kind of after he finishes up his stint writing for SmackDown and kind of starting the SmackDown 6?
Well, he's 56 years old today. So in the real world, in the corporate world, that would be firmly in what I think a lot of people would term, your peak earning years. Okay. So I think over the past decade and a half, that period you're talking about, I think he's doing what he has to do to earn as much money as possible. And that's not to say that he doesn't believe in his work or that he's pulling the wool over people's eyes. Not that that would be something we'd put past the Paul Heyman, but look, he gave it a go with ECW. It didn't work out for a variety of reasons. He was in and out of WWE, from about 2001 on, and he's got himself a nice little niche in the company. And I think this is a corporate Paul Heyman that we're seeing over this time period that you're talking about. So he's also very smart in that he always knows how to play to the crowd that he needs to play to. Okay. He was the rah-rah guy in ECW, the counterculture promotion. And when it suited his interest, he played up to the smarks. He played up to the newsletter readers and those sorts of things. Paul Heyman's an interesting guy where I'm not sure we always know what his real thoughts are, because he's smart enough to always be playing the right angle for what's best for him in a given situation. So that's the long answer. I guess the short answer is this is corporate Paul, who is in his, he's in his peak money earning years. He's starting to push 60, and he's not going to do a whole lot to rock that boat. If anything, he's going to try to extend this and continue to make big money by doing what he's always done his entire career. And that's being very calculated and attaching himself to the top stars in the business. He was ahead of the curve on CM Punk and attached himself to CM Punk very early on. He obviously attached himself to Brock Lesnar for a number of years. Now he's doing the same with Roman Reigns. He did so with Ronda Rousey. You can go right down the line. And this is both on screen and off. I mean, he's a legitimate advisor to Brock Lesnar. So if WWE wants to do business with Brock Lesnar, by proxy, they have to do business with Paul Heyman because he's pulling the strings. He's been very wise his whole career to form these relationships with whoever he thought was next. I mean, he was very early on Stone Cold Steve Austin. He attached himself to stunning Steve Austin in WCW, and he was part of the Dangerous Alliance. He brought Steve Austin immediately into ECW after WCW fired him. So not only does he have great vision and understand the wrestling business and have a tremendous eye for talent, but he knows which talents in particular are going to be, no pun intended, the next big thing. And he's very wise in that he attaches himself to those acts. How he manipulated and politicked his way into being Roman Reigns' manager is just, that doesn't get enough talk or attention. I mean, because now he's a vital part of that act.
I think that comes back to the most significant relationship in his career, which is his relationship with Brock Lesnar. Do you recall how that started? Did Paul want to be Brock's manager? Did Paul push for that? Did Vince or someone else say, hey, Paul, we want to pair you with Brock Lesnar, this new guy we're going to push? Do you remember the specific details about how he first started working with Brock? Did it date back to OVW even before he was on the main roster?
It did. It was before he was on the main roster. As I recall it, he got into Brock's ear because Brock is one of those guys, again, where everybody knew. I mean, for this guy to fail, it was going to have to be an extraordinary set of circumstances. He was going to succeed by accident. Just the level of athlete he was, his unique look. Brock Lesnar was going to be quite literally the next big thing. And Heyman got in that ear early. As his advisor, as his mentor, whatever word you want to use. And then, listen, Heyman's a master politicker. And, I'm sure that he got in McMahon's ear and found a way to become Lesnar's on-screen representative as well. And, he got Brock to trust him. And, the rest is history. He's been attached at the hip to Brock Lesnar for the better part of 20 years, which has been obviously advantageous to Paul's career.
Yeah, and I think that is kind of what leads to the Roman Reigns and Paul Heyman relationship, because this has never really been reported, but it's always been a working theory of mine, in that something changed when Roman was not around during the early periods of the pandemic and they were in the WWE Performance Center. And he was just mysteriously gone. And people speculated, oh, it's because of his, he's a cancer survivor and he's at higher risk. And he's kind of publicly shot that down, saying that the type of, leukemia that he has is not really at any greater risk than any other person would be. But something changed because he comes back and he's a heel, which is something that he had never been in his main roster career. And he's aligned with Paul Heyman. And so I've always been the working theory that Reigns, in his years feuding with Brock Lesnar and working with Brock Lesnar when they were still pushing him as a babyface, saw Brock Lesnar's career as the ideal wrestling career. And it is. I don't think anyone has been paid more money to wrestle than Brock Lesnar. Would you agree with that?
He's got to be near the top. And your next point is probably, if you compare how much money he's paid to how little he works, I mean, that he might be the clubhouse leader in that particular proportion.
Sure. I think he's probably, if we accept that he's been the highest paid member of WWE's roster for the last 10 years or so, maybe John Cena was at one time, but I just think, so Brock's made more money than anyone else, and he works less than anyone else, and he's booked like a god. Yeah. I mean, that's the ideal wrestling career for anyone. And if you're Roman Reigns and you spent, years working 100+ dates a year and kind of being positioned beneath this guy, at times being positioned above him, but oftentimes being positioned below him, that's like, you look at him as kind of like your role model and being like, I want to be that guy in the business. And what is the linchpin of that? Let's pair me with Paul Heyman. Let's make me be a heel. I mean, Roman Reigns' character now is essentially Brock Lesnar's character from 4 or 5 years ago. He's, a bad guy, and he's paired with Paul Heyman, and he's just booked to look like a cool badass at a level that nobody else on the roster is presented as. And I'm sure he's making a boatload of money, and he doesn't have to work as many dates. And so I think like Heyman pairing himself with Brock and being the Brock guy, both in and out of the ring, as you mentioned, has really established himself, really opened up that bridge for someone like Roman to being like, I want to be Brock. Let me get Paul. And Heyman can, I don't know if he's advising Roman outside of the ring, but I think he's certainly kind of got his hands on Roman's character and persona, and perhaps crafting some of the match layouts that Roman has done. And I think in that end has obviously been advantageous to Heyman, because now, who knows how many years Brock has left. I always feel like every time Brock Lesnar has a match, people say that it's his last match and they don't know when he's going to come back. And yet somehow he always comes back. I don't know what could be motivating him to keep coming back when he's, this is his last match on his contract or whatever, but he always comes back. And so I think lining himself with Roman gives him the kind of that next generation of top star. And I'd be curious to know if he aligns himself with someone else coming up. I don't know who on earth that would be, perhaps Gable Stevenson, but I would assume that the natural progression would be someone to replace Roman Reigns, and who that person would be. Paul Heyman would probably be interested in aligning himself with them. And that person would probably be interested in having Paul Heyman be there, aligning himself with them, because Heyman has shown his ability to kind of be the kingmaker and being the guy that the top stars want to work with. And that's always an advantageous position when you're working in a company like WWE.
Yeah, I mean, look, all the rules are new with Vince McMahon out and Paul Levesque in charge. Okay. But even with that said, I think the younger wrestlers on the come up, whether it's who you mentioned or maybe Braun Breaker or somebody like that, they also see the television and they know that if you're attached to Paul Heyman, you're a main event act. So I'm sure
Curtis Axel.
Unless you're Curtis Axel. Look, they haven't all been winners. Hey, look, they did the Cesaro thing and that didn't work out. And, so there have been other failures as well where it just, we went through the whole I'm a Paul Heyman guy era. And I think that they thought that they could just throw anybody with him and it would just, automatically work. And that proved not to be the case. Could they have given more time to somebody? Look, nothing's going to make Curtis Axel work. You either have it or you don't. Could they have given more time to the Cesaro pairing? Yeah, maybe. But to get back on track, yeah, I'm sure, there's no doubt that Heyman has his eyes on the next guy, assuming that, the new regime still sees the value in Paul Heyman as an on-screen performer. It could be a situation where Paul Levesque sees how Heyman does his business and is maybe one step ahead of him. And if he doesn't see the same value in Heyman as an on-screen performer that Vince McMahon did, then maybe after this Roman thing runs its course, that role goes away. Maybe he doesn't want Paul Heyman to attach himself to the next, top star coming down the line. So you have to be careful with that because I don't know how this new regime views him. We know that Paul Heyman, in the past at least, has had a very contentious relationship with Stephanie McMahon. The stories are very public. They're documented in books. They're documented in newsletters. Okay. It's not telephone game. It's real. But I don't know if that relationship has been repaired over the years. I haven't heard of any stories over at least the last 10 years that those two have once again, been at each other's throats. Maybe they've stayed out of each other's paths. Stephanie more on the corporate side with, philanthropy is the what's her famous what's the famous quote? What's the tweet?
I forget, but it's philanthropy. Yeah. Philanthropy is the new something. It's how brands are going to win.
Yeah. So she's, more on the corporate sponsorship side and he's on screen and on the creative side. And maybe it's just because they never cross paths. I don't know, but we have to keep an eye on that dynamic as well. Okay. Because if you are the career-long arch rival of the person who is running things wife, that's an uncomfortable situation.
Well, Stephanie is the CEO now. She's wielding more power now.
She's the boss. I mean, you make a great point. She's technically the boss. I mean, her husband's just in charge. I was just speaking from the creative side, but you're absolutely right. Like she's his boss now, his direct boss. And other times when she's been his direct superior, it has been a train wreck and he has left the company. When she was head of creative and he was writing WWECW or, it's never worked out. So I think that's worth keeping an eye on.
Yeah. We mentioned like, this is corporate Paul Heyman and he's done what he has needed done to do to make a lot of money and to survive in the company. And that's really new to his career. If you look at his career kind of before his return with Brock Lesnar in 2012, Paul Heyman was a guy who got fired a lot. And Paul Heyman was a guy who made a lot of enemies. And he was someone that didn't really fit in with the corporate culture that, he always was clashing with Vince McMahon. And so it's kind of funny and unusual to see him now. He's corporate Paul Heyman. He's, wearing a suit every day. He's like the punk rocker that cut his hair and, is now wearing a tie and is working a normal 9-to-5 job. His legacy will always be, and I'm under absolutely no illusions that when Paul Heyman dies, the first thing people are going to write about him is his ECW and his influence on alternative professional wrestling and changing the entire wrestling business. But it's fascinating to me to see his career have evolved to now he is this corporate survivor who understands totally how to play the game in order to maintain his job status, because that really wasn't the case up until the last 10 years or so.
No, and I think you just get older and you have some kids and you see the bigger picture, and he probably saw a landscape that he couldn't get back to on his own, and he probably saw a landscape within the company that no matter how full of piss and vinegar he was going to be, he wasn't really going to change. So it could be a case of conformity, or as I said at the top, it could be a case of perhaps we think we know this person better than we think we do. And maybe he is just wise enough and smart enough to conform, or maybe he really does view things in a way that he wouldn't want maybe he likes the fact that when he dies, his obituary is going to start with that he was the brains behind ECW and spearheaded the change that influenced, the next 15 years. Maybe he likes it that way and doesn't want to be viewed as, the corporate sellout, so to speak. If you notice when he does media, you would think that Paul Heyman would be a tremendous media interview, or a first round pick of wrestling. In reality, it's the opposite. He's an awful interview.
He's really annoying.
You don't get anything out of him. Because he's smart enough to dodge the interesting questions and answer them in a non-interesting way. And he always comes across to me as someone who's just protecting his spot in the company. And I want to make this money as long as I can. He just isn't interesting. And you would think that he would be. And I don't know if that's because, again, he's being savvy and being smart, or if he's saving all of that for his third act, right? Because he's kind of in his second act. Maybe he's saving all of that. He's never done, all of the times he's been in and out of WWE, he's never gone to RF and done a shoot video. He stays he hasn't written a book. And for a time, there was a lot of money in ECW nostalgia, and there probably still is, where he could have done those things and made a shit ton of money, but he's never done that. So I don't know if it's just self-preservation in a corporate sense, or if he's saving all of this for a third act and he's really just going to let it all go. And it's hard to get a handle on which of those things that it is. And it could be both. It doesn't have to be one or the other, but he's an awful media interview. And that wasn't always the case. Early in Paul Heyman's career, he was everywhere and he was interesting, whether it was John Arezzi's radio show, or, whether it was interviews with Wade Keller when Keller was still doing the Torch Talks, or whether it was mainstream media going on radio shows and promoting whatever. And this is going back before ECW, the WCW days when, you mentioned how young he is. He was in his mid-20s when he was on national TV. He always looked a little older, and he got the name Paul E. Dangerously because he resembled Michael Keaton, and he looked like the Johnny Dangerously character that Michael Keaton played in one of his early films. So he always looked a little older. He had the premature baldness going, and but he was very media friendly early in his career, and he was a great media guest. And now that has all changed. You listen to him now, and here's the tell with Paul Heyman, because I consume every second of anything that he does. I study this man. When he does media interviews, this is the tell. The slower he talks, the more disingenuous he is being. It's interesting because disingenuous is the wrong word. The more guarded he's being, because he's not a man who as we know, he's hyper. He's a fast talker. Okay. He's a carnival barker. When he slows it down in these media interviews, and you can go listen to him on Richard Deitch's podcast, and he did a number of others, slow, calculated, and gives you nothing. That's Paul Heyman in his 50s, as opposed to Paul Heyman in his 20s and 30s, when he was the fast-talking carnival barker who was still working you and was always working you, but was doing it in a far more interesting way than now, where he's just boring corporate guy who gives you nothing.
Yeah, I mean, he started out as a teenager as a photographer and had his own little newsletter. So he was always media, he's obviously media friendly. He started out as a member of the wrestling media when he was very young. To me,
he was working WWF shows as a photographer at the age of 12 and 13.
Yes, he was like backstage with superstar Billy Graham and taking photos with the Grand Wizard and things like that. So, what's interesting about him in these, like you talked about his media appearances now and the kind of dictation that he does and what that means. I find him like super annoying. And this is twofold. The first is he gives comments like the one where someone asked him about his dismissal, Vince McMahon's dismissal, and he's like, "You couldn't say anything bad. I have nothing to say about Vince McMahon. He's made people a lot of money." I'm like, none of us believe that Paul Heyman believes that he can absolutely say nothing bad about Vince McMahon. I'm sure he could think of many bad things he could say about Vince McMahon.
Yeah, he's full of shit. Yeah.
Or, he was giving his speech during the WWE tryouts that they were having at SummerSlam, where he was telling everyone what they needed to be a superstar. And he really just kind of says general platitudes, and literally anybody could have said that works for WWE. But because Paul Heyman said that, it comes with extra credence. And so I find that annoying because I think he's being disingenuous. And then another aspect of it that annoys me is how people react to it as if he's saying something super profound because he's Paul Heyman, and people want to believe that everything Paul Heyman says is some sort of genius business level move, and that he understands pro wrestling at this higher plane than anybody else. So even if he's just saying something very basic, it comes across as something brilliant because that is the image of Paul Heyman. And they haven't quite caught on to the aspect that you're talking about, which is that the slower he talks, the more guarded he's going to be and the more protective he's going to be of his words. And I find that kind of a fascinating dynamic, and I think it goes back to a whole generation of people now, and my age range would fall into that generation, don't really know anything about Paul Heyman. And they know that he's from ECW, and they know that he did ECW, and they know that he did great things, but they don't really know that much about his actual career in ECW. They know him as this guy that older fans talk about as being brilliant, but I don't know how many of them actually understand how brilliant he was or in what ways he was brilliant. That makes any sense.
Yeah, no, it does. Look, as I said, I don't think any of us know what he really thinks about anything, because I don't think to him it's advantageous for him for us to know those things. We think we know what he thought about pro wrestling in the mid 90s, but what he was really doing was giving us what we thought we should know about pro wrestling in the mid 90s. He was giving us the product that he knew that people wanted in that time and place that was going to create a niche for him. Did he really believe in that product? I don't know the answer to that, because he couldn't then go do an interview with Wade Keller and say, well, this hardcore stuff and this edginess isn't really for me, but it would destroy the whole facade. The house of cards would crumble. He was the cult leader. So this is what I'm trying to get across. He always knows what's best for him. And in that time and place, that's what was best for him, to fill a niche in pro wrestling and to make a go at being a big time promoter, which he probably dreamed about laying in bed at night, the night before going to MSG to take pictures. And at one point, they were rivaling WCW in pay-per-view buys, and they were, drawing 4,000 or 5,000 people at their peak to show in a super competitive environment. So I don't know what he really thinks. And we know what we do know is he knows how to present himself and what to present to the people at a given time. That we do know.
Right. And, him going to WWE and that kind of being his career post ECW, where he's going to be handicapped a lot in what he could do. Like, he couldn't recreate the exact version of ECW in WWE. He certainly tried to, but he was never going to be able to do that because Vince McMahon's view of what professional wrestling should be was so radically different than what Paul Heyman had presented in ECW. So he hasn't really been able to, follow up on his ECW vision with a subsequent vision of pro wrestling, where he's really been allowed to do what he would want to do, which adds to the mystery of what his real aspirations are for pro wrestling.
Well, let me tell. I don't know if you're aware of this or if your listeners are aware of this, but okay, so his plan for WWECW was to roll it out with the nostalgia because that brings the people back, right? So you bring back Sabu and the Sandman and Tommy Dreamer, and you get all these guys, and you get eyeballs on it for the nostalgia aspect. But at that point in time, Paul Heyman knew that hardcore was long dead, and that the nostalgia was only going to take them so far. And at that point in time, he felt that realism and MMA inspired wrestling was going to be the next thing because he has always had his eyes on what is the next thing. We talked about that earlier, attaching himself to the next big stars. He's always looking down the road, even while he's succeeding in the current state. So he knew the nostalgia would bring people in, and that's how they would get this thing kicked off. But his plan was to delve more into reality-based wrestling. MMA, UFC was just getting big with The Ultimate Fighter. It was around that time. And that's why percolating underneath the surface was CM Punk. He wanted to use, I believe Alex Kozlov was a guy who never really got in the mix, but that was someone else he wanted to push later in the game. Santino Marella, but as a serious character, I think was another one. Kurt Angle came to the ECW brand. And just as they started to get him in the mix, that's when everything fell apart. So Paul saw the next thing. He knew that you couldn't do 1995 ECW for a 2005 or 2007 television audience. It wasn't going to work. The nostalgia would eventually fade. The problem was there were too many clashes with Vince. The famous last straw was at the December to Dismember show, where Vince tore up the show that Paul had prepared, which would have made, it would have been the main event with the Elimination Chamber. And what Heyman wanted was for CM Punk to eliminate the Big Show right off the bat. First elimination. That's the Heyman. It's one of Heyman's booking. One of Paul Heyman's most well-known booking tropes is in a multi-man match, eliminating the champion first, because now everybody watching the match is going, oh, we're getting a new champion. We know that at minimum because the champ's out. And he wanted Punk to eliminate him because he eventually was going to build that brand around CM Punk. McMahon got a hold of the script, and the first thing he did was, we're not building this match around Punk. We're building it around Bobby Lashley. That's number one. Also, we're taking Sabu out of the match because I want to put more, because Sabu was a babyface at the time. We want to put more heels in the match, so we're taking Sabu out, and I think they either replaced him with Test or Bob Holly. Not really important to the overall story I'm telling, but they replaced Sabu with one of those two heels because McMahon's idea was, well, if we're going to have a superhero babyface, he's got to overcome as many heels as possible, right? So Sabu's out. The match is built around Lashley instead of Punk. And McMahon also, the way he changed the match was to eliminate Punk early. Well, Heyman knew this was a disaster. He knew that the fans were going to reject this. He predicted all of it. As you know, December to Dismember overall was a complete failure. One of the most, notoriously, one of the most notorious failed pay-per-views in wrestling history, not even WWE history, in terms of attendance, buy rate, and the actual product. And all of the things that Paul Heyman predicted would go wrong with McMahon's new script went wrong. And, they had that famous blow up as the McMahon was looking through. This goes to show that Vince wasn't as disconnected from, the smart world as some people might think. As the story goes, McMahon was looking through feedback from the show, and it was all negative, and it shocked him. He genuinely thought it was a great show, and that Bobby Lashley was a new conquering hero. And he asked Paul Heyman how he thought the show went. And Paul Heyman went down the whole laundry list of reasons why the show was terrible. And it was a giant setback and how the brand was doomed. And Vince blew up at him and gave him the famous line of, it was an excellent show with an excellent finish. Get with the program. And that's when Heyman knew he had to go. And, he did the next TV. And if you recall, he gave like the tear-filled, it's time for me to go now thing on that week's episode of ECW, and he was gone. And then from there, WWECW was completely Vince McMahon's vision. And we know how that went. But the Heyman plan of transitioning from the hardcore nostalgia to what the new next big thing is going to be never had a chance to play out, because Vince essentially just made it another homogenized third WWE brand that was the same as the other two, with every now and then they would have, an Extreme Rules match, which was basically just a DQ match, no DQ match, from the other two brands with different branding. So anyway, that's an example of, Heyman always looking forward, and another example of one of his many exits from the company where everything just went wrong. He didn't want to stick around and, and be with the sinking ship, because, knowing that none of these ideas were going to work, and not having a chance to execute what he saw. And look, he was right at the end of the day, he was right about Punk. But to be fair, Vince was also, he was right about Lashley. Lashley's had a great career.
Ironically, after he kind of morphed into an MMA inspired gimmick.
Yeah. And here's the other thing. I'm sure Paul Heyman was very high on Bobby Lashley, but he knew he was all wrong for that place and time, and for what he wanted to do, and maybe too soon, and all those sorts of things, whatever the case may be. Well, it was all about Punk, and Vince just never, not until many years later, when his hand was forced, did he see it with Punk.
And the legend of Bobby Lashley goes that when he was in OVW, there was this discussion. They're saying Vince cannot see this guy, because Vince is going to see this man and want to push him to the moon, and he's not ready yet. And that's what ended up happening. Vince saw him and said, holy cow, look at, this man. This is everything that Vince McMahon would ever want to physically look at in a professional wrestler. And he did push him too soon. And Lashley's, there were a lot of big muscular guys that Vince pushed way before they were ready, and their careers totally flamed out. And Lashley probably deserves a lot of credit for salvaging his career into quite a good run now. But it was one of those things where Vince kind of got something in his head, and Paul didn't want to accept that. And I think what's very interesting is we can look back, flash forward 15 years in the future from what you were just describing, Paul's kind of exit from the WWE ECW revival. He gets put back in charge of Monday Night Raw as basically the head writer of Raw. He gets put, I think this was June 2019. And he's in that position officially for 1 year, but by most accounts, he was only really in complete control for a few weeks before Vince started meddling again. But instead of kind of blowing up and seeing the writing on the wall and leaving WWE, Vince McMahon or Paul Heyman kind of quietly stepped back and resumed his position as special counsel to Brock Lesnar, and then got himself entangled in Roman Reigns. So I don't know if it's just the situation was that different, or he learned his lesson, but he definitely changed kind of his perception of what he would be willing to do, what he would be willing to kind of sacrifice to remain employed. And maybe that's just, he's older, he's wiser, he has more responsibilities. I don't know how old his kids are, but I think it's a distinct change, that kind of how he lost power in WWE after being named the head writer of Raw, and how he reacted to that versus other times in his career where he's kind of been on the outs with WWE.
I get the sense that he knew that wasn't going to last. I mean, that was Vince reacting to shareholders, and he hired Eric Bischoff at that time too. And everyone kind of saw, people inside wrestling at least saw through that as Vince hiring the names that shareholders and the general public would be familiar with as the names that were running wrestling the last time it was, a mainstream success. So you had Vince McMahon, Eric Bischoff, and Paul Heyman, the big three, and now they're all in the fold and things are going to turn around. And I think most of us saw through that, and you can't think that Heyman didn't. So
certainly with Eric, people were, I think, immediately dismissive of this is just a ploy. It's a marketing scheme. A lot of people thought Eric was being set up to be a fall guy for when SmackDown didn't, have 4 million viewers and a 1.0 every week on Fox, that they could fire Eric like early on and say, well, it was Eric Bischoff. He was the problem, and we're going to turn things around now. But Paul, Heyman, there was a lot more, I think, internal confidence that Heyman might be able to to last on Raw. And certainly from a fan perspective, people were a lot more enthusiastic about what Heyman would be able to bring to Raw. And I think that, looking back on it now, it wasn't great, but I really enjoyed the Heyman Raw era because he clearly had a vision and he clearly picked out like 5 or 6 guys that he really wanted to push as top stars. Drew McIntyre was one of them, but all right, he really wanted to push Andrade. He really wanted to push Angel Garza. He wanted to push, Malachi Black or Aleister Black, whatever.
Yeah, Humberto Carrillo, Mandy Rose. There was a whole crew that he selected.
And they made earnest attempts.
Cedric Alexander. There was a number of them.
There was earnest attempts at creating a new generation of stars, something WWE hasn't done in quite a long period of time.
Right.
And I remember there was that Royal Rumble, that really good Royal Rumble that he kind of, I don't know how much of it was his layout or how much he was involved in, but it felt like all of his fingerprints were all over it, which was the Royal Rumble where Brock Lesnar came out first and just tossed out a bunch of guys, but then got really tired. And then Drew, tossed him out midway through. And it was just an excellently laid out Royal Rumble match. And I remember watching it and seeing like all of the guys who were in the match who ended up getting eliminated by somebody else. They were kind of feuding and there seemed to be a reason for everything that was going on. And I remember saying, this is really a positive step for WWE because it's very clear that there's a creative direction going on, that everything seems to be connected and they're trying to create a new generation of stars. Some of those guys obviously are not going to work out, but some of them will. And one of the interesting things about that was contrasting that so far, and it's only a few weeks in, with kind of Triple H's time in charge. I haven't gotten the sense that he's trying to elevate a bunch of new stars, or at least there's a long-term creative vision for that. I think he's brought back some people to kind of make a statement about who's running the show, but I would like to see the Triple H era kind of follow, at least pick a bunch of wrestlers in their 20s or early 30s and kind of elevate them to star status. It's kind of a shame that Heyman never really got a full chance to do that, because I think WWE would be in a much better situation right now from a creative standpoint and from a prospective star power standpoint if they had kind of followed those kind of plans.
Well, what are our 2 major themes here? Self-preservation is 1, and always looking to the future is 2. Those are the 2 themes here that we could talk about with Heyman. And that short-lived Raw tenure was an example of looking to the future. He picked that group of 8 to 10 wrestlers that hadn't been previously pushed and decided, we're going to make some stars here. Some will make it, some will not. That's just the way it goes. But if you give me time, if you give me 18 months and 8 to 10, and let me handpick 8 to 10 wrestlers, I'm going to get you a couple stars out of the bunch. We're going to get a few people over as new stars. But again, he wasn't given the time. You can't do that in 3 or 4 months. And the ratings predictably tanked because these are people who are not over yet. But it's kind of like when you do a spring cleaning in your house, sometimes you have to make a bigger mess to ultimately get the job done. And, it was going to take 18 months. And Vince McMahon was not going to wait around 18 months while his ratings slowly dilapidate to see and take a gamble to see if these people can get over. And Bischoff Bischoff was fired very quickly. And Heyman wasn't fired, but he was removed from that position. Once that Vince no longer needed that smoke screen, and also because he was far too impatient to wait it out, and more than likely didn't see what Heyman saw in most of those people, with the exception of Drew McIntyre and I suppose Mandy Rose. None of the others have really gotten a substantial push in the aftermath. So he didn't like the people Paul picked, and he wasn't patient enough or confident enough that Paul could eventually get them over. But he was given a job, and he just did it. He likely knew he wasn't gonna see the finish line, but he did it in earnest the best way that he knew how to do it, and that was, I'm looking to the future. And unfortunately, we didn't get to see the end result of that either. Just like we didn't get to see what would have been the end result of WWE CW.
And there was some internal, politicking going around. I remember the line was that he was using the catering crew because the wrestlers he wanted to push were all guys that were just backstage and catering previously.
Yeah.
And, you know, the guys were smaller. I thought he played the game in the sense, if you watched Raw during the Heyman era, it wasn't that much different from a show than when Vince was maybe more hands-on or whatever. I think he still was really hands-on, but it wasn't like you're watching a completely different product. In some ways, the Triple H led Raw is very different from the Vince Raw, or more different than the Vince Raw than the Heyman Raws were, than the ones that Heyman was kind of replacing. But
I still think you have to play to Vince's sensibilities.
Right. That's what he was doing.
Yeah.
He was playing to his sensibilities. He was playing the game. He was just picking guys that were different. And Vince just didn't like that. And it's a classic thing. It's, well, why did you put me in charge if you weren't going to like any of the things that I did?
Right.
You know, Vince could have been in charge and just picked guys that Vince liked. And Bruce Pritchard could have done that. That's what he ended up doing.
Right.
And so it's one of those things where I think he was never really going to succeed at all. But I did appreciate the vision that he attempted to do. And we talk about that. You mentioned the third chapter of Paul Heyman. I've kind of led myself to believe that this is what he's going to be for the rest of his career, is that he's going to continue to kind of be around WWE and be of service to them in ways that he finds advantageous, and that doesn't really rock the boat that much. But despite Triple H taking over from Vince McMahon, I think there's no doubt there's a certain type of power vacuum within WWE that was not there when Vince was there. It just can't really be compared to when Vince was there. And so how does he fit into that role in that new corporate environment that WWE has? And you mentioned this, he hasn't always had the strongest relationship with Stephanie McMahon. And how does Triple H and Stephanie and Nick Khan, how do they see Paul Heyman? Do they see him as a very valuable resource whose input is incredibly necessary to the show? Or do they see him as a potential threat that could undermine them? Nick Khan, maybe not as much as the other two, but I could totally see Stephanie and Triple H seeing Paul as a guy who is very good at currying favor with powerful people within the company, being and someone who has a successful track record of being a creative mind in wrestling, as someone that's a threat to them and could undermine them.
Well, yeah, we kind of talked about this earlier, in that they're savvy to his games, and they may not want him getting his claws into whoever's next, whether it's Braun Breaker, Stevenson, whoever, because then look at the headaches that gives them in attempting to run the company because of the things that you talked about earlier. Anyone that he gets attached to ends up making a ton of money on a limited schedule, and he ends up being the puppeteer. So they may want to eliminate that possibility. We don't know. This is why I say it's all unknown. Vince had fallen into a certain comfort zone with Paul Heyman, you know, after a very contentious early relationship that they had. It's been pretty quiet on that front for a long time, to the point that he entrusted Raw to the guy. You know, so yeah, you're right. I don't know what his modern relationship is with either of those people. We know that Paul Levesque can be, you know, again, the game. I mean, that's to shoot. I mean, this is a guy who, you know, he's always making moves, and he always knows who to eliminate, and he knows how to politic. And he could see him as a threat, and Stephanie might still harbor some resentment towards him, and might feel like she doesn't have to smile in the hallway anymore because her father puts up with him. I don't know the answers to those questions. So yeah, you know, I don't know. And that's definitely plays into why when people ask Paul Heyman about what's going on with Vince McMahon, he is not going to give you a controversial answer. He's not going to tell you what he really thinks. You know, the guy's daughter is his boss. What do you want him to say? You know, that's why I don't even think you can hold it against him. What do you want
absolutely
him to
not.
say? Yeah, and I'm not saying that you are, but you know, for anyone listening, it's like, what do you want him to say? He knows literally where the bodies are buried. Do you want him to unearth them? He's going to get fired. You know, and it's self-preservation again. And it's, you know, everyone thinks that they're brave and they're bold and they're righteous until you're in those shoes. And I think this is why, and this is completely off the beaten path, and I won't belabor this, but it's why I've said too, I don't hold the people who work in WWE or who used to work for Vince McMahon, who got very rich working for Vince. I don't hold them to the same standard in discussing the Vince situation as I do the media, because the media owes Vince nothing, and they owe nothing but honesty to their and clarity and thought to the people that they serve, which is their readership or their listenership or their subscribers. The people who know Vince McMahon personally and worked for him, you have to cut them a break. Okay, I'm not saying to have to, throw a party for the guy and celebrate his history of rape, but at the same time, there's a relationship there that outsiders do not have. Let them, they have to handle this. I don't hold them to the same standard is my point. And again, I don't want to derail this completely in that direction, especially someone who's still working for the guy's daughter. You give an empty statement, a safe statement, and you move the fuck on.
This will not turn into the Jesse and Joe wrestling media discussion podcast.
That's for another day.
That would be behind a paywall.
That's when I have the FU money and I'm ready to just burn it all.
Yeah, down. I mean, sell the Patreon to Static Media and you'll be ready to go.
Oh yeah.
Does it bother you at all as a lifelong Heyman fan that there are people like me and my age who did not watch ECW growing up that think Paul Heyman's like really brilliant, but maybe don't totally understand like why he's brilliant? They just like his WWE character. Like there are people now that find this version of Paul Heyman that he's doing with Roman Reigns like totally engaging and totally cool because he's Paul Heyman and they've kind of been told that he's like supposed to be awesome and cool. And I think we can objectively look at his work now and say that he's actually been kind of really boring over the last year or so, and that his character seems to have no evolution whatsoever.
Oh yeah, as Roman Reigns' wise man. Yeah, this is without question the least interesting on-screen work that he's ever done in his career. Yeah, I agree with that. It's a one-note character. It's I find him extremely off-putting in all the wrong ways with the faces that he makes, and the my tribal chief stuff, and yeah, it's no, I don't find it interesting at all. I'm not a fan of it.
He's weirdly unnecessary to the act now too. Like there was this whole thing where when he was feuding with Brock, and there was this idea that he was you didn't know whose side he was on and who he was gonna turn on, and was he gonna turn on Roman and side with Brock again? And that kind of faded away. I know Brock did just give him an F5 through the table at SummerSlam for a big pop, so maybe it's still kind of burning there somewhere. But at this point, it doesn't seem like he's really necessary to the act anymore. And someone of Heyman's abilities as an on-screen character would seem to be better served somewhere else.
Yeah, but again, this goes back to attaching himself to these stars both on screen and off. So at this point, he's got his claws into Roman, and Roman probably feels very comfortable with Paul Heyman on screen, and and that's Paul's manipulations off screen. So that's kind of the brilliance of Paul Heyman. That's what we've been talking about here for an hour. So I don't necessarily disagree that he's kind of, now look, he needed to be there for the Brock feud, I think, because of that whole dynamic, and that worked. And that was really the most interesting thing about this little run. Whose side is he on and that sort of thing. But yeah, on a week in, week out basis, it's repetitive, and and yeah, I really don't know how much it adds to Roman's act. It's here's what's interesting too. This is the least interesting, phase of Paul Heyman's on-screen career, but it's by far the most interesting phase of Roman Reigns' because he's doing his best on-screen work to me as a heel, and Heyman is doing his least interesting work, and they're all in one package.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I think with Roman's character, kind of like at some point, probably like after WrestleMania, he just kind of like stopped evolving as a personality. And I feel like he's been kind of stuck at the moment. He's had the title forever. The matches he's had tend to be very repetitive, even if one of them involves someone lifting up a ring. I find they did this whole thing where he first turned heel and he was feuding with, the Usos, and there was the one Uso that liked him and the one Uso who liked him, and the right hand man and nobody's bitch. And that kind of just resolved itself. We didn't really, I feel like, get like an on-screen resolution for that. And since then, he's just kind of been this guy who is a heel who wins all his matches, and the Usos interfere and Heyman interferes. And it doesn't seem like there's any real progress going with Roman's character. And I think that impacts how I view Heyman, which is these guys who are just kind of doing the same act week after week. And there's no real clear end in sight or, resolution for what's going to happen with Roman's current arc. He just seems to be in this perpetual mode where he's a champion forever and no one really gets built up to try to beat him.
I think hardcore WWE fans, they like that shit. I mean, Brock Lesnar was just a guy who, once he offhandedly uttered the phrase suplex city in a match, that's what he became. And all of his shit was the same for a long time. And it's the same with Roman now, but I think that plays to their look. People buy tickets to WWE shows and they're like Pavlovian dogs. They want to pop for the entrance music. They want to pop for the choreographed entrance. They want to pop for the signature moves, and they want to pop for these. They want these repetitive. The Miz hasn't changed in 15 years. I mean, this is what they play to their fans want. They like this. So I agree. I don't think Roman has evolved at all either. We had what's going to happen with the two Usos, like you said, the right hand man and nobody's bitch, and that kind of just didn't, like you said, didn't even get the nobody's bitch just kind of eventually conformed. Like if you can't think of the story pivot, then it wasn't vital. And then
didn't one of the Usos didn't the right hand man get injured or something like that? And so they needed an Uso to be Roman's minion. So the guy who was kind of reluctant to join Roman just kind of slid into that role, and nobody noticed because people have a hard time differentiating the Usos and can't remember which one didn't like him and which one did.
You could be right. I mean, I watch this shit every week and I don't remember how the other guy ended up conforming, which tells you all you need to know. But and then you had the Lesnar thing with which side is Paul on? Aside from that, look, I wrote about it in real time, which was, I may have been the only person in wrestling media saying that the Roman storyline sucked.
I assure you, Joe, you were not the only one.
There's people falling all over themselves to praise it in real. And I'm like, this is the same shit. You could, it's like it's like these segments are just on repeat. I mean, what's so brilliant and great about this other than I never said that Roman's performances were not, I thought, and I still think, Roman's doing the best promo work and playing to that character. He's tremendous, but the stories themselves are repetitive and boring and have never evolved.
Yes, this character, the heel character that Roman has been doing, is way better suited for his level of personality and charisma and that kind of character he can best portray, as opposed to trying to pigeonhole him into a John Cena style babyface, which is a very difficult role to have. This role is more understated and better for someone of Roman's skill set. I want to get back to Heyman, just to kind of wrap things up here. I wanted to ask you you mentioned the third act, and let's suppose that things do not go well for Heyman in WWE and he ends up getting released or fired, or he asks for to leave, or he doesn't resign his contract, he wants too much money, whatever ends up happening. He is now no longer in WWE. Obviously, people would say he can go to AEW. What do you see him wanting to do if he does get left, if he leaves WWE? And what do you think about the possibilities of him in AEW or perhaps another wrestling promotion? I find him in AEW to be an interesting idea. I don't know how in practice how it would end up working out, but what do you think about Heyman outside of WWE now? If he just got plopped outside of that company and now he had to find something else to do in wrestling?
I struggle with what would his job be in AEW? That's what I struggle with. I can tell people right now, Tony Khan is never letting go of his creative. Listen, they can drop to 100,000 viewers for Dynamite. That man is not letting go of his career. He loves it. He has waited his whole life for this. He lives for it. He has a bottomless pit of energy. That's never going to be an issue. and he's never letting go of that control. So why would you bring in a Paul Heyman, right, to lead your creative or to because those are his strengths. So what would he do in it? I don't understand what his role would be. And I would also be a little wary of bringing him into my office and bringing him into my company. He's a kind of guy where, I admire him but at the same time, I would want to keep him at arm's length. He's always doing what's best for him and playing his angle. And he's very, very persuasive, to put it lightly. I mean, the guy has made a career of being a manipulator. I mean, let's just call it what it is. And he's the ultimate carny salesman. And you're dealing with someone like Tony Khan, who I totally respect as a businessman and a wrestling promoter. I don't know how you can't at this point, with how quick and how fast that company has been a success and all of those things. But he's also someone who grew up idolizing Paul Heyman and going to ECW shows, a young Tony Khan going to these shows with a young Joe Lanza. Okay. So there's danger there too, in that he already admires and respects the guy. It'll be that much easier for Heyman, if he wanted to be nefarious about things, to, get in this guy's head and do what's best for Paul, which he's always done over the course of his whole career. I would be very, very apprehensive and careful if I were Tony Khan, if Paul Heyman were to become available. And look, Heyman doesn't need the money. I mean, he's wealthy at this point, with his years in WWE and all of that. So it's not as if he'll be banging down the door begging for a job. So what would be his motivations if they're not money? It would have to be power and control at that point. So, and yeah, ultimately Khan's always going to own the company, but I don't know. It would feel weird to me. I don't know, what would his role be? Yeah, of course you're going to put him on camera in some capacity, but that's secondary. You're not going to hire him as an on-screen talent. Okay. You're going to hire him to be an on-screen talent and to do something for your company. I just don't know what that would be if Tony Khan is always going to be in control of his own creative.
Right. It would have to involve some form of Tony Khan delegating some creative aspects to Paul Heyman. And I don't think
just to have him in the room and bounce stuff off of him and get ideas, but is Heyman going to be satisfied with that?
As an advisor, and you run the risk of bringing someone like Paul Heyman into your locker room. Not to speculate too much, I would assume that Paul Heyman's presence in the AEW locker room would lead to maybe some disagreements. It's maybe the last thing that the AEW locker room needs at the moment is Paul Heyman, showing up and having his allies and having his people in the locker room. Who knows? I mean, maybe you could do that and everything would be fine, but it would be a risk, just the same way that I think Triple H and Stephanie McMahon may view Paul Heyman as a threat or a risk. Now, Tony obviously wields absolute control in AEW, so he'd never be really in danger of losing that control, but it could potentially backfire on him in the sense that you have someone who might be able to kind of undermine some of your efforts.
If you could get Paul Heyman in the room with you to make suggestions and say, I see something in this person that you might not see, or I don't know, Tony, I might do it this way instead of this way. What's interesting though, is I do think they have a lot of similar philosophies in how they present their wrestling. I mean, ECW was also a very fast paced show, which didn't give you a lot of time to think in the same way that Dynamite is a fast paced show. And obviously Tony draws a lot of influence from Paul Heyman. I see Heyman fingerprints on his show. I see Paul Heyman and Bill Watts more than anybody else. I mean, there's a little bit of everything else as well, because Tony's a student of the game, but those are the two that I predominantly see. If you can get him in a room and strictly as an advisor and someone to help iron out details and someone to help you identify talent, but it's just, and maybe an older Paul Heyman wouldn't be the manipulative force that he's been his entire career, but I'd be wary. Right.
And Tony would definitely respect Paul Heyman.
And that might be the problem, in that he admires him too much.
And I think that's a problem with Jim Ross still being on commentary.
You're dead on correct. Yep.
And that's one of the things I do kind of I don't say worry, but have a little bit of concern about Tony in the sense that as a lifelong, and this would be a problem for me too, if I was running a wrestling company, and probably for you as well, Joe, like as a lifelong fan, I would maybe have some sort of emotional attachments to certain people and talents that the smart, ruthless business person would have to say, hey, you know what? It's time to let this person go. And
Yeah.
I think anyone that's ever run a business has probably come across that aspect at one point, in the sense that there might be someone that you like, someone that you know personally that maybe isn't the best fit for what your company needs to do. And that can become risky when you kind of start bringing in all of your idols to come work for you.
I think my first rant regarding Jim Ross has to go was 2019. So yeah, I completely agree. At this point, I think at worst, Jim Ross isn't any kind of positive and is probably a net negative to the overall presentation of the company. But again, there's just too much respect there, not even just among Tony Khan, but everybody else there. They look, he's the voice of wrestling, which I keep waiting for the day where we get our cease and desist. But that's how people, it's too much respect. So and when you add in Heyman's manipulative and just very persuasive elements of his personality, it could potentially be incredibly toxic. And I don't want to paint Paul Heyman as just strictly a con man who's out to pull this guy's company out from underneath him, but he is Paul Heyman. So be wary is what I would say to Tony Khan, but he knows that.
Yeah, I don't think he doesn't need our advice on that end. But
Yeah.
For what Paul Heyman would do, and if he were to go to AEW, could you see him? I don't know, like an Impact or an NWA? It seems at this point of his career too small scale for him to do. He never went to Impact, even when there maybe was an opportunity for him to do so, and maybe that had to do more with management of Impact that existed then as opposed to now. But could he ever kind of be in that position where he could run an entire wrestling company by himself?
No, because he doesn't want to be attached to failure again. So those are unwinnable situations, the NWA or Impact. And when he did flirt with Impact the first time, he proposed to them terms that he didn't really want to be there, because the terms he proposed were, if they accepted them, it would be too good to refuse. He wanted full control. He wanted 51% ownership. I don't remember all the exact, but it was just a ridiculous, unacceptable offer for the Carters at the time. And it was basically, do you ever make a counter offer in a negotiation that the other person will never accept because you really don't want the thing that's being negotiated? Like, that's what that was. It was, I really don't want this, but if you're going to hand me the moon and stars, well, I can't tell you no. And, so that's when Impact, would have been in a far better position than they are today, because now they'd have to, the additional, competing with AEW and everything else that would happen. Paul Heyman is not going to attach himself to these third tier pro wrestling. The only other pro wrestling company I could see him working for today would be AEW. In fact, he was more interested in dabbling with MMA companies during his brief hiatuses from WWE than he was with wrestling companies. He was in the mix to get involved in ownership groups with a lot of the various MMA groups that have popped up, because he saw it. But even at this point, I don't think he'd be interested in that now, because again, he's always looking for the next thing. Now UFC essentially has a monopoly on that. It's not, it wouldn't be very smart to get in on the ground floor of a new MMA company in 2022. For the same reasons, it wouldn't be very smart to, take a very small, relatively speaking, payday to work as Billy Corgan's booker. He's just not going to do those kinds of things.
One thing I wonder about is that Paul Heyman's peak as a booker and creative mind, by most people's interpretations, is about 30 years ago, maybe 25, 30 years ago.
Yeah.
In the history of professional wrestling, there have been many, many, many very good bookers who peak at one point and then get brought back at some later points, and they do not do well.
Yeah.
And so I do wonder now, like we've discussed, Paul Heyman is innovative. He's always looking for the next big thing that's going to pop off the page in pro wrestling. He's always trying to be ahead of the curve. But there are plenty of promoters you can point to: Bill Watts, Jim Cornette, Jerry Jarrett, Bill Watts again. You can just go Ricky Choshu. You can go through these times where formerly great bookers are brought back to book and they just don't have it anymore. And I do wonder about that, if Heyman were to ever resume kind of a lot of authority over a wrestling product, if maybe he's just done, because nobody, 30 years of consistently being a good creative mind, that basically doesn't happen. Maybe people can point to Giant Baba or Sam Mushnick, but that's pretty much it.
Yeah.
And so I do wonder if Heyman would be susceptible to that.
I would say no, because in the vast majority of those cases, those people left wrestling and came back.
Right.
And when you leave, you're fucked. Heyman never left. Though a lot of those people who returned, their finger was no longer on the pulse. Paul Heyman will never be accused of not having his finger on the pulse. In fact, he always has his finger on what's coming next. So I don't think he would. I don't have any doubt that Paul Heyman can book successful pro wrestling or promote successful pro wrestling today. Provided he has the right tools and provided he has the right support. And, again, which is why I don't think he would go to a third tier company, because those are unwinnable situations. So yeah, I understand what you're saying, but at the same time, he's never left the business. He knows who the prospects are. He knows who's next. He knows who is currently connecting with fans. He knows what works for the current fan base. So he doesn't take his eye off that stuff.
I mean, does he though? I mean, I only ask that because yes, he's never really left the wrestling business the way like Bill Watts did, but he's also been in WWE, which is a very insulated company with a very insulated amount of thought that goes into it. Is he out there scouring the indies? Is he closely following things that AEW did that were successful?
I would
perhaps, but we don't know for sure.
I would be stunned if he doesn't watch Dynamite every week. Stunned. And I'll take it a step further. I would be very surprised, maybe not stunned to the level of, him. I would bet the deed to my home that he watches Dynamite every week. I would be very surprised if you asked him about Game Changer Wrestling and he didn't know what that was or what was going on. I think he knows what's happening. I think he has his finger on the pulse of everything. And knows what's going on, and so that's why I think he wouldn't have any trouble. Even though you mentioned, but he also presided over what is generally considered the greatest creative era of SmackDown as well, and that was, but that's going back 20 years too, at this point.
Yeah, just the way wrestling has been so slow to evolve over the last 2 decades and the lack of changes, both in the competition that has existed, really makes the time period seem like crazy in perspective. And it's, to me, one of the things that's so weird to me about Heyman is that, like I said, he was 35 when he showed up in WWF for the first time. He's 41 when he leaves WWE ECW. And since then, only 41 years old, his creative influence on professional wrestling, his active influence on professional wrestling, has been limited to essentially being the manager of 2 guys.
Yeah.
And that, to me, it's a shame, is really what it is. In a different environment, we would have had many other attempts of Paul Heyman presenting a wrestling product. In a different world, he would have been brought into some place that would have been able to give him kind of control that maybe he wanted, and to give him a fair shake at presenting a new creative vision. And unfortunately, that just hasn't happened for him. And that's due to WWE's monopoly of the business and just the way the business and economics have shaken down in pro wrestling.
Yeah, we were robbed of that. I completely agree. On another timeline somewhere, Paul Heyman's been the creative mind behind an alternate vision of wrestling all of these years. And we absolutely were robbed of that. We got it in ECW and, it was great. We got it for a while with SmackDown and it was great. And then outside of that, since then, it's just been small, fleeting opportunities that never had a chance to play out. So I completely agree, and it's a shame. And when Tony Khan brought Taz into the fold, I made a similar point. I'm like, Taz has been mailing it in everywhere he's worked for the better part of 2 decades. And his run there as the manager of Team Taz was just such a revelation. And it made me think, Taz, 20 years of this man's career have just been squandered by people who had no idea what to do with him. And Taz has been a complete revelation in AEW, right down to his social media, where pre-AEW, he was seen as this grumpy, bitter, piece of shit guy that you don't want, and now he's like everybody's favorite uncle. He has had a complete, not just career rejuvenation, but image rejuvenation in AEW. He just seems like a happy, normal guy now.
And he came back, and like you said, his work in Team Taz, it wasn't like he radically changed his character at all. He was just Taz. And it really hammered home. It's like, wow, we missed 20 years of him just being Taz and being this awesome, engaging personality.
Right. And on the same token, we've missed out, for the most part, on decades of what Paul Heyman could have brought to the table creatively during periods of pro wrestling that were pretty fucking dire, if we're being honest. Can I curse on this podcast?
Sure.
Okay. We're pretty fucking dire in terms of what we were being given as fans during the era of WWE dominance and samey TV that they had for 15 years, where Impact would just kind of comically limp along and pick up steam, every 18 months or so, where people would say Impact is good now, and it would last for 4 months, and then we'd be right back to Impact being terrible.
Impact giving the book to some of the most incompetent people that they can find.
Yeah, right. While this guy was, wasted away from our point of view anyway, but making the most money of his life, which great for him. But the overall point here, we were robbed of who knows what, and I don't know if we'll ever get that again. I mean, that little Raw run may have been the last shot, unless the Levesque family shocks us and gives this guy. But look, Paul Levesque has been waiting for this his whole life. He's not going to give that up.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we're done with Paul Heyman as a career, because Tony Khan is never relinquishing that. I'm telling you right now, he's in my brief interactions with him, and just, this is his baby, and it's going to be his baby until he hits the grave. And so where is there a role for Paul Heyman to be creative in pro wrestling? He's smart enough not to start something. He's smart enough to go not work for these 3rd-tier promotions. So it's over.
Yeah. And it's over for him. And he really is the last of this lineage of kind of the typical booking wrestling mastermind, the genius booker, the guy who came up with all these great angles and did all of these things. You can, the George C. Scotts and the Bill Watts and the Sam Mushnick and these people, this history of wrestling. He seems like he was the last person from that type of era. I don't think Vince McMahon really qualifies for a variety of reasons, but mainly just because he's such a massive figure that you can't really attribute. He's not going to go down as a booking genius in that sense. I don't think Tony Khan will be viewed like that. I think the business is just different, and the way we think about these people is very different. But Paul Heyman really, to me, is the last one of that era of the great wrestling booker. And we talked about, like, if he was born 20 years earlier, he would have had many more opportunities to put out his creative vision, because he would have been able to bounce around between different territories. If, maybe he got stale one place, or he got run out of another place because he, made enemies with the wrong people, or all of these things that ended up happening. But because he was kind of at the very, very tail end of the concept of wrestling territories when he broke in, he never really got that opportunity. He kind of had to create his own with ECW. But outside of that, it was really just, you got to play ball with the big leagues, or that's it. And that's what's ended up happening to him. And it's kind of sad, because I think, to me, he is the last link to that style of booker and kind of that kind of image that was promoted by everyone of the genius, the mad genius booker and the ace creative guy. I don't think that person really exists anymore in the minds of pro wrestling fans.
No, I think Tony Khan wants to be that guy. It's funny because you said George C. Scott, and I know you
who's an actor, yeah,
who's the actor who played Patton, but I know you meant George Scott. So I know who you meant. You meant
I really
George
unnecessarily added the C Scott to him. Like that was a big difference.
Well, you went with the far more famous George Scott, to be fair. And but it's funny you mentioned George Scott because he fits into the archetype we talked about before of guys who were considered great bookers and great booking minds. And he had a great career as a booker, both in the Carolinas, and then a lot of people don't know this, but he was Vince McMahon's first booker during the early Hulkamania era for a little while there before, he left in, I think, 84 or whatever it was.
He booked the first WrestleMania, I believe, right?
Yeah, he was instrumental in the very, very early days before, Pat Patterson rose to power and Vince and all that. But he worked for McMahon early on during that era. And he is, like we talked about earlier, a guy who largely left the business, and they tried to bring him back to WCW around 88 or 89, and he had been gone just a few years. And the best story to exemplify how quickly you can be out of touch, one of his first moves was to sign the Iron Sheik to a very expensive long-term contract. Everyone in wrestling knew the Iron Sheik was washed up by 1988, 1989, and really offered no value. Iron Sheik was so bad, and they had to pull him off of TV because he had become such an embarrassment between the bells. So while he's sitting home getting paid $175,000 a year or whatever it is, which was huge money at that time, to literally do nothing, they forgot that he was under contract, and they forgot that they had an option that they needed to decline for the next year because he was out of sight, out of mind. The option kicker kicked in, and they had to pay the Iron Sheik an additional year on that contract to do absolutely nothing because they forgot to decline the second year option on his deal. So that's another great example of a booker and how quickly you can be out of touch and make a horrible decision. And obviously, George Scott, minus the C, did not last very long in his final attempt at booking pro wrestling.
Yeah, and that list is it's not like it's not just like, a few guys who are good and a few guys who are bad. It's like guys who were all regarded as being some of the best. If you were to rank like who are the best bookers in wrestling history, all of those names would come up, and yet they all fell into the same problem, which is once you're out of the business and the business changes quick enough, you're done. You have to have that kind of adaptability. And you see that, honestly, we see that with a lot of people. You see a lot of people who were, without naming names, previously on the pulse of everything pro wrestling, but at some point they hit a certain age where it's just, they can't see it anymore.
Yeah.
And it's going to happen to all of us, Joe. We can't run away from it, but
yeah, there's a day where all of our feet finally get caught in the cement, and you just want to put it off as long as you can. But at some point, and it will happen to all of us, it's like in Moneyball where they're telling, young Billy Bean at the kitchen table, at some point, someone tells us we can no longer play the children's game. For some of us, it's at age 18. For some of us, it's at age 40. But that day comes for all of us. I can recite every line in that movie, by the way. But the same thing in wrestling and in wrestling analysis. There's going to come a point where we all become pick your favorite example of somebody who's completely out of touch, and our feet and the cement is going to harden around our feet. And that's going to be it for us. You're absolutely right.
Yeah. Dave Meltzer said once, he said this in an interview, I think he did last year, that I found really interesting, is that someone asked him about how do you still find wrestling interesting after being around it for so many years and covering it so intensely. And he said something along the lines of, the wrestling that you like today is not going to be the wrestling that is popular in 5 years. And then if you don't accept that, then you're never going to find pro wrestling interesting outside of a brief period of time. And unfortunately, there's a lot of people like that.
Yeah.
It's something that we're all going to have to adapt to as we get older.
Yeah, I'm sure at some point, modern wrestling is going to evolve into something that I despise. I hope that time doesn't come. I will always try my best to adapt and at least understand why something is working. And I think, to circle back to Heyman, I think he's keenly aware of that, and he's someone who totally understands what we're talking about here.
All right, that's it. Thanks a lot, Joe. Again, Joe is of the Flagship Wrestling podcast and the Flagship Wrestling Patreon, I will provide a link in the description of this video. If people are wondering, Jason Unpresser, who is the co-host of this show, Jason texted me a little while ago, and he told me that he's just getting super busy with his life and can't really have the time to do the podcast anymore. And so I want to wish Jason all the best. He was really helpful with getting this thing off the ground. He's got a big job with Nesson now. So all the best for him. I told him I'm glad he's busy now, because it's a good thing for him and his career. But he's not going to be around in the future. I'm going to continue to keep this show going, just because I'm going to do like kind of a rotating series of guests and different people I want to bring in, like how we brought in Joe today. But I want to thank Joe a lot for carving out the time in his busy schedule to do this. He's getting an appliance delivered. He's getting a dishwasher, right?
Yeah, man, I got a dishwasher on the way. And, I'm trying to give you I'm trying to give you a good quality podcast performance here. And I got a plumber about to knock on my door. So I think we did a nice job though. So.
Yes. And well, your kids are back in school right this week. So now you've got a lot more time during the day to bullshit with me, right?
Correct. Always willing to come on.
All right. Well, thanks a lot, Joe. Thanks a lot to all of our listeners, and we'll see you guys again next time.